At 3:15 in the afternoon on March 7, 1945, a German engineer captain named Karl Friezenhan gripped the handle of an electrical detonator inside a railway tunnel carved into the cliffs above the Rhine River. Outside, American tanks were firing at the bridge approaches. American infantry was advancing through the streets of Remagen. In seconds, they would reach the western ramp of the Ludendorff Bridge, the last intact crossing over the Rhine into the German heartland. Friezenhan turned the handle. Nothing happened. He tried again, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. Still nothing. The firing circuit was dead, severed somewhere along its length by American shellfire. 300 kilograms of explosive sat on the bridge pilings, wired and ready, but the signal could not reach them. In that moment of terrible silence, where an explosion should have been, the course of World War II changed forever. The Ludendorff Bridge was a double-track railway bridge spanning the Rhine at Remagen, a small town of about 5,000 people nestled between steep forested hills in the Rhine Gorge, roughly 20 kilometers south of Bonn. The steel section measured 325 meters in length and connected the town on the west bank to the village of Erpel on the east bank, where the tracks disappeared into a tunnel bored through the massive basalt cliffs known as the Erpeler Lay. This cliff rose more than 130 meters above the river, a natural fortress on the eastern approaches. Construction had begun in 1916 at the height of the First World War, when the German Imperial Army needed additional rail capacity to move troops and supplies to the Western Front. The great battles of Verdun and the Somme were consuming men and material at unprecedented rates. The bridge was designed by the architect Karl Wiener of Mannheim and named after General Erich Ludendorff, the quartermaster general who directed German military strategy alongside Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Construction took 3 years, employing thousands of workers, including Russian prisoners of war, at a cost of approximately 2 million marks. The completed bridge stood on 2 massive stone piers rising from the riverbed and was flanked by twin fortress towers of dark basalt at each bank. These towers were not merely decorative. Machine gun positions were built into their walls, and their thick construction could withstand artillery fire. The bridge had been designed not merely to carry trains, but to be defended against any enemy who might try to seize it. Most significantly, in 1938, after Germany remilitarized the Rhineland, 60 zinc-lined demolition boxes were attached to key structural points on the bridge girders, each capable of holding explosive charges. The bridge was prepared with destruction in mind. It was meant to serve Germany in war, and then, if necessary, to die rather than fall into enemy hands. By early 1945, the war that had begun with German armies sweeping across Europe was ending in catastrophe for the Third Reich. The Western Allies had broken out of Normandy the previous summer, liberating Paris in August and pushing German forces back toward their own borders through autumn. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate December offensive through the Ardennes, had achieved initial surprise but ultimately failed at enormous cost. The Wehrmacht had lost tanks, artillery, and aircraft it could not replace. More importantly, it had lost experienced soldiers and officers who would have been invaluable for the defense of Germany itself. Now American, British, Canadian, and French armies were closing on the Rhine from the west, while Soviet forces advanced from the east. Berlin had been bombed repeatedly. German cities from Hamburg to Dresden lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, could barely contest Allied air superiority. Fuel shortages grounded tanks and aircraft alike. The Rhine River represented Germany's last great natural defensive barrier. For 2,000 years, this river had marked the boundaries of empire, civilization, and conquest. The Romans had built their frontier along the Rhine. Charlemagne had crossed it to unite his empire. Napoleon had forded it on his march toward disaster in Russia, the last hostile crossing from west to east before 1945. The river was wide, in some places over 400 meters across. It was swift, fed by alpine snowmelt and spring rains. It was cold, dangerously so for any soldier who fell into its currents. German commanders knew that if the Allies could be held at the Rhine, even for a few months, perhaps some negotiated peace might be possible. If the Allies crossed the Rhine in force, the war would be lost within weeks. Throughout February and early March of 1945, German demolition teams systematically destroyed every bridge over the Rhine as Allied forces approached. At Cologne, the Great Hohenzollern Bridge was dropped into the river on March 6th. At Düsseldorf, the bridges fell. At Bonn, at Koblenz, at Mainz, the charges detonated and the spans collapsed. By the first week of March, more than 30 Rhine bridges had been destroyed. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was one of the last crossings still standing on the entire river. German military doctrine was absolutely clear. Bridges must not fall into enemy hands intact. The orders came from the highest levels of command, ultimately from Hitler himself. Any officer who failed to destroy a bridge in time faced severe punishment, potentially including execution. Yet the execution of these orders required a delicate balance. Blow a bridge too early, and German troops still on the West Bank would be trapped, unable to retreat. Blow it too late, and the enemy would capture it. This terrible calculation would determine the fate of the Ludendorff Bridge. The morning of March 7, 1945, began cold and overcast in the Rhine Valley. Light rain fell intermittently. On the West Bank, elements of the American 9th Armored Division were advancing toward the river as part of Operation Lumberjack, a broad offensive aimed at clearing German forces from the West Bank. The division's Combat Command B, under Brigadier General William Hoge, had orders to proceed south toward Koblenz. The Rhine itself was not their immediate objective. No one on the American side expected to find a bridge still standing. The Germans had destroyed every other crossing. Why would Remagen be different? A task force under Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engemann departed the town of Meckenheim that morning, approximately 17 kilometers from Remagen. The force included reconnaissance vehicles from the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron, infantry riding in half-tracks from Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, and tanks from the 14th Tank Battalion. Among the tanks were 5 brand-new T-26E3 Pershing heavy tanks, armed with 90mm guns and protected by armor thick enough to resist German anti-tank weapons. The first American tanks capable of meeting German Panthers and Tigers on competitive terms. Leading Company A was 2nd Lieutenant Carl Timberman, a 22-year-old officer on his first day commanding the company. The previous company commander had become a casualty the day before, and Timberman had been promoted from platoon leader. He was young for such responsibility, but the war had consumed officers at a terrible rate. Men grew old quickly in combat, or they did not grow old at all. Timberman had been born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, to a German mother and an American father who had served in the occupation forces after World War I. When Timberman was still an infant, barely 18 months old, his parents had immigrated to the United States, settling in the small town of West Point, Nebraska. He had grown up American in every way that mattered, but German blood flowed in his veins, and German was his mother's tongue. Now he was returning to the land of his birth as a soldier in an army that would decide its fate. On the German side, the situation was desperate and confused. Captain Wilhelm Bratke commanded a bridge security detail of only 36 soldiers, most of them convalescents recovering from wounds, older men pulled from rear area duties, and members of the Volkssturm, the People's Militia hastily conscripted from teenagers and men too old for regular military service. These were not elite troops. They were the remnants of an army that had already sacrificed its best soldiers on the Eastern Front and in Normandy. Captain Karl Friezenhan, a veteran in his late 40s who had served as an engineer in the First World War, was responsible for the demolition preparations. Friezenhan knew bridges. He understood what it took to destroy one. He had repeatedly requested 600 kilograms of military-grade explosive to ensure the Ludendorff Bridge would be completely destroyed if the Americans reached Remagen. What he received instead, at approximately 11 in the morning, was 300 kilograms of donarit, a weak industrial mining explosive made primarily of ammonium nitrate. It was the kind of explosive used in quarries and construction sites, not for destroying massive steel and stone bridges. It was not nearly enough to bring down a structure as solidly built as the Ludendorff. At 11:15, Major Hans Scheller arrived from the 67th Corps headquarters and took command of the bridge defense. He faced an impossible situation, the kind that exists only in the collapse of armies. German troops were still streaming across the bridge from the West Bank, fleeing the American advance. Infantry, artillery units, supply vehicles, even civilians were crossing in disorganized columns. If Scheller blew the bridge now, hundreds of German soldiers would be trapped on the wrong side of the Rhine. If he waited too long, the Americans might seize the bridge intact. His orders required authorization from higher headquarters before detonation, but the chain of command was breaking down. Communications were intermittent. There was no one to ask. Scheller decided to keep the bridge open as long as possible. He would give the retreating soldiers a chance to cross. Then, when the Americans were nearly upon them, he would destroy the bridge. It was the humane decision. It was also the decision that would cost him his life. At approximately 12:56 in the afternoon, the lead elements of Task Force Engemann reached the forested bluffs overlooking the Rhine Gorge. Scouts from the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron looked down through the bare trees at the river valley below. What they saw made them reach immediately for their radios. The Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. Its dark steel span stretched across the wide gray river, connecting the burning town of Remagen on the west bank to the cliff and tunnel on the east. German soldiers and vehicles were crossing it in disorganized columns, fleeing eastward. A few German soldiers could be seen on the bridge towers, but there was no organized defense visible. The greatest prize of the Western Front lay before them, seemingly intact and almost unguarded. Major Ben Cohn, the operations officer of Combat Command B, received the report and immediately contacted Brigadier General Hoge. The message was simple and stunning. The bridge at Remagen was still up. Hoge faced a decision that could define or destroy his career. His orders were to continue south toward Koblenz, not to cross the Rhine. Crossing the Rhine was supposed to be a deliberate operation planned at the highest levels and coordinated with Montgomery's forces to the north. Seizing a bridge without authorization could be considered exceeding his orders, a court-martial offense if things went wrong. If the bridge blew up while his men were on it, or if his forces were destroyed in an exposed position east of the Rhine, he would bear responsibility. But Hoge was an engineer by training, a 1916 graduate of West Point who understood bridges. He knew what an intact Rhine crossing meant. If the Germans destroyed this bridge, the Allies would be forced to make an assault crossing of the Rhine, probably under heavy fire with significant casualties. If the bridge could be captured, divisions could pour across unopposed. The war could be shortened by weeks, perhaps months. Thousands of lives could be saved. Hoge made his decision in seconds. Take Remagen, take the bridge. Timberman's infantry moved down through the town, clearing snipers and scattered resistance. German soldiers were abandoning their positions, some fleeing toward the bridge, others simply surrendering to the first Americans they saw. An anti-tank gun crew fired one round before abandoning their weapon and running. Machine gun nests that should have held up the American advance were empty or manned by soldiers who surrendered without firing a shot. The German defense was collapsing. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, as the first American tanks reached the western bridge approach, Friezenhan detonated a cratering charge buried beneath the earthen ramp. A tremendous explosion tore a gap in the roadway. Then, Friezenhan turned the main detonator handle. Nothing happened. The firing circuit was dead. He tried again. Still nothing. American shellfire had severed the wires somewhere along their length. He turned to his backup, a timed fuse attached to a primer cord that would ignite the main charges chemically. A German soldier named Faust lit the cord and ran. The cord burned toward the charges. Then another explosion, but this one was wrong. The charges did not detonate as designed. Instead of a catastrophic failure of the main span, the bridge lurched. Some structural members were bent or twisted. The bridge swayed visibly and groaned, but the main structure still stood. The weak industrial explosive, less than half the amount Friezenhan had requested, had not been enough to bring down a bridge built to survive. Major Murray Devers moved forward to coordinate the assault and gave Timberman his orders. "Get your company across that bridge." Timberman looked at the twisted steel, the smoke still rising from the damaged sections, the gaps in the planking, the German positions visible on the far bank. He could see figures moving in the bridge towers. He knew the bridge could blow at any second, that another demolition charge might be waiting, and that German machine guns would open fire the moment his men stepped onto the span. He later recalled his response. "Well, we can try it, sir." American mortars opened fire on the far bank, white phosphorus rounds bursting among the German positions and creating a screen of dense white smoke. The Pershing tanks rolled as close to the crater as possible and began firing their 90-millimeter guns at the bridge towers and any visible positions on the eastern side. Under this covering fire, Timberman organized his assault. Staff Sergeant Joseph Delizio would lead the 3rd Platoon across first. Delizio was an experienced, non-commissioned officer who had survived the fighting across France and into Germany. He knew his business. Right behind the infantry would come 3 engineers from Company B of the 9th Armored Engineer Battalion, First Lieutenant Hugh Mott, Staff Sergeant John Reynolds, and Sergeant Eugene Dorland. Their job was critical. They had to locate and cut every wire, remove every unexploded charge, and ensure no secondary detonation would drop the bridge into the Rhine while American soldiers were on it. The men gathered at the western end of the bridge. Before them stretched over 1,000 feet of damaged steel, swaying slightly in the wind, gaps showing the gray water below. At the far end waited an unknown number of German defenders with unknown weapons and possibly more explosives ready to detonate. Everyone knew the bridge could blow at any second. There was only one way to find out. They had to run. Sergeant Alexander Drabick, a 34-year-old squad leader from Holland, Ohio, who had worked as a butcher before the war, was among the first to move. He sprinted down the center of the bridge, not looking left or right. He did not look at the twisted steel or the gaps in the planking where the river showed through below. He ran as fast as he could, his boots pounding the wooden deck, his rifle clutched in his hands, knowing that a moving target was harder to hit than a stationary one. Behind Drabick came the rest of the 3rd Platoon, then the engineers, cutting wires as they went. Mott, Reynolds, and Dorland worked their way across the span, snipping cables that might lead to hidden detonators, kicking unexploded charges over the edge and into the river. Bullets struck the steel around them. German machine guns opened up from the eastern towers, but the accuracy was poor. The gunners rattled by the American mortar fire and the sheer audacity of the assault. The bridge swayed and groaned beneath their boots, but they kept moving. Timberman crossed approximately 10th in the line. He was the first American officer to set foot on the east bank of the Rhine by force of arms since Napoleon's era. As he reached the far side, His men were already fanning out, clearing the bridge towers of German defenders. Delisio entered one tower and found German soldiers with a jammed machine gun. They had been trying to clear the malfunction when the Americans burst in. They surrendered without a fight. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Timberman had approximately 100 men established on the east bank of the Rhine. Not a single soldier from Company A had been killed or wounded while crossing the bridge itself. The impossible had happened. American forces were across the Rhine. News of the capture raced up the chain of command. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commander of the 1st Army, called General Omar Bradley at 12th Army Group headquarters. "Brad, we've got a bridge." Bradley was meeting with Major General Harold Bull, the SHAEF operations officer, when the call came. Bull represented the staff of Supreme Headquarters, where careful plans had been laid for the Rhine crossing. Those plans did not include a bridge at Remagen. The main crossing was to be Montgomery's Operation Plunder, weeks away with massive forces and elaborate preparations. A bridge at Remagen was in the wrong place. Bull dismissed the news. "You're not going anywhere down there at Remagen. You've got a bridge, but it's in the wrong place. It just doesn't fit in with the plan." Bradley's response was immediate and sharp. "What the hell do you want us to do? Pull back and blow it up?" Bradley called Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was dining with airborne commanders at his headquarters in Reims. Eisenhower listened to the report, then told his guests what had happened. "That was Brad. He's got a bridge across the Rhine, and he apologized for it, said it was badly located at Remagen." Then Eisenhower gave his orders. "Hold on to it, Brad. Get across with everything you need, but make certain you hold that bridgehead." He authorized Bradley to commit up to 5 divisions to exploit the crossing. Throughout that evening and night, more troops poured across the damaged bridge. Engineers worked frantically to shore up the weakened structure, laying new planking over the gaps, reinforcing damaged sections with timber supports. Sherman tanks crossed during the night, their crews praying with every meter that the structure would hold their weight. The reaction in Germany was fury and disbelief. When Hitler learned that the Ludendorff Bridge had been captured intact, his rage was reported to be volcanic. He screamed at his generals, demanded explanations, ordered immediate retribution. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received a phone call from Hitler on March 9th, informing him of his replacement. But Hitler's vengeance did not stop with the generals. He appointed General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical Nazi officer from the Eastern Front, to head a special flying court-martial that would travel wherever necessary to punish those responsible for the bridge's loss. Hübner brought his own 2-man execution squad. When a legal officer offered him a copy of the military code of justice to guide the proceedings, Hübner reportedly waved it aside. The only authority he needed was Hitler's personal order. 4 German officers were executed on March 14th. Major Hans Scheller, who had hesitated to destroy the bridge while German troops were still crossing, who had made the humane decision, was shot in the back of the neck near Rimbach. He was 31 years old. His wife Liesel was pregnant when he died. She would give birth to their son without ever seeing her husband again. Their farewell letters to their families were burned by Hübner's orders. Their pensions were revoked. Their names were to be erased. Captain Friezenhan, the engineer who had done everything humanly possible to destroy the bridge with inadequate materials, who had been knocked unconscious by a shell burst and still managed to detonate the only charges available, was acquitted by the court. Even Hübner could not blame a man who had tried. While Hitler's vengeance consumed his own officers, Germany threw everything it had at the Remagen bridgehead. Artillery batteries from across the region were directed at the bridge and its approaches, initially falling at a rate of 1 round every 2 minutes. The area between Remagen town and the western bridge approach became known among the Americans as Dead Man's Corner. Soldiers crossed it at a sprint, knowing that any moment could bring another shell. The Luftwaffe launched 367 sorties against the bridge between March 7th and 17th. The attacking aircraft included obsolete Stuka dive bombers making their final significant appearance of the war, and modern jet aircraft including the Arado AR-234, the world's first operational jet bomber. These revolutionary aircraft could not be intercepted by conventional fighters, but they were few in number, and their bombs could not be aimed with precision. American anti-aircraft defenses responded with overwhelming force. Approximately 700 anti-aircraft guns were concentrated around the bridgehead, the densest concentration of such weapons in the entire war. American gunners claimed 109 German aircraft shot down, a loss rate of approximately 30% that made continued attacks suicidal. In an unprecedented escalation, the Germans launched 11 V-2 ballistic missiles at the bridge from launch sites in the Netherlands, approximately 200 kilometers away. These were the first and only tactical use of V-2 rockets during the entire war. The rockets had been designed as terror weapons against cities, not precision weapons against military targets. Aiming them at a bridge was an act of desperation. Most fell harmlessly in the surrounding countryside. Germany also attempted unconventional attacks. On the night of March 17th, 7 SS combat swimmers, equipped with underwater breathing apparatus, were sent downstream to attack the American pontoon bridges with plastic explosives. They were detected by canal defense lights, a secret searchlight technology seeing its first combat use. The intense illumination revealed the swimmers in the water. 2 died from the cold, 2 were killed, and 3 were captured before reaching their objective. Floating mines and explosive-laden barges were released upstream to drift toward the bridges. American engineers had anticipated this possibility and constructed log booms and steel net barriers that intercepted the floating weapons before they could reach the crossing points. Throughout this bombardment, American combat engineers performed the dangerous and essential work that gave the bridgehead permanence. The 276th Engineer Combat Battalion worked around the clock under constant artillery fire and air attack, replacing damaged planking, reinforcing weakened structural members, keeping the bridge passable for the endless columns of trucks and tanks crossing into Germany. Downstream from the Ludendorff Bridge, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel David Perrine, began constructing a tactical treadway bridge at 10:30 on the morning of March 9th. Working in shifts day and night, they assembled prefabricated sections, anchored pontoons, and laid roadway across the swift current. They reached the east bank at 5:10 in the morning on March 11th, completing the bridge in approximately 43 hours. It was the first tactical Allied bridge across the Rhine, and it meant the bridgehead no longer depended on the damaged Ludendorff structure alone. By March 12th, elements of 3 American infantry divisions had crossed into the bridgehead. The perimeter stretched 4 miles deep and 14 miles wide, a solid foothold on German soil. Approximately 25,000 troops crossed the Ludendorff Bridge itself before it was closed. In total, over 125,000 American soldiers established themselves on the east bank. But the Ludendorff Bridge had been slowly dying since the moment it was blown. The initial explosion, though insufficient to collapse the structure, had destroyed the upstream truss and severely damaged the downstream truss. For 10 days, that single remaining truss had carried the entire weight of military traffic crossing into Germany, loads it was never designed to bear alone. The constant artillery bombardment created new damage daily. Structural fractures spread through the weakened steel. At approximately 3 in the afternoon on March 17th, exactly 10 days after its capture, workers on the bridge heard a massive crack as rivets began to fail. The bridge deck started to vibrate and sway. Men dropped their tools and ran for the banks. A vertical hanger fell away. Then the arch collapsed, carrying the adjoining spans down into the Rhine with a tremendous crash. 28 American engineers were killed and 63 were injured in the collapse. The men who died had been working to preserve a bridge that had already given everything it could give. By the time the Ludendorff Bridge fell, its loss no longer mattered strategically. American engineers had completed multiple tactical bridges across the Rhine. The bridgehead was secure, expanding daily and unstoppable. Within weeks, American forces would break out of the Remagen bridgehead, drive deep into Germany, link up with Soviet forces advancing from the east, and bring the war in Europe to its conclusion. Eisenhower's chief of staff called the captured bridge worth its weight in gold. German Field Marshal Kesselring called its capture a military catastrophe of the first order. Hermann Göring said the loss made a long defense of Germany impossible. The capture of the Remagen Bridge demonstrated what determined soldiers can achieve when given freedom to act. The bridge was not taken by generals making grand plans in distant headquarters. It was taken by sergeants who ran forward when instinct told them to hide, by lieutenants who led from the front when prudence counseled caution, by engineers who cut wires while bullets sparked off the steel around them, by a brigadier general who trusted his own judgment more than his orders. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, the first American soldier to cross the Rhine at Remagen, returned to Toledo, Ohio after the war and resumed his work as a butcher. He rarely spoke publicly about what he had done that March afternoon. He preferred the quiet life he had known before the war, the ordinary rhythms of work and family. He died in 1993 at the age of 82 on his way to a reunion of Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. Second Lieutenant Carl Timberman received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions. He learned from the military newspaper Stars and Stripes that his daughter had been born while he was fighting for the bridge. After his discharge, he returned to Nebraska and worked as a salesman, but civilian life did not suit him. He missed the Army, missed the sense of purpose and belonging. He re-enlisted, was later recommissioned as an officer, and deployed to Korea. He died in 1951 at the age of 29 of cancer. He is buried at Fort Logan National Cemetery. A park in West Point, Nebraska, where he spent his boyhood, bears his name. Captain Carl Friezenhan, the engineer who had tried so desperately to destroy the bridge with inadequate explosives, survived the war. In 1954, he returned to Remagen and met the combat historian who had documented the battle. He asked quietly whether Timberman and Drabik had received any recognition for their bravery. When told they had received the Distinguished Service Cross, he nodded. "They deserve them," he said, "and then some." Hans Scheller's son Gerd grew up without knowing his father. He was only 8 months old when Scheller was executed. After the war, Gerd worked to clear his father's name, demonstrating that the execution had been judicial murder ordered by a regime in its death throes. On February 2, 1967, a German regional court posthumously acquitted Major Hans Scheller. Gerd sat in the courtroom with his mother and brother as the verdict was read. Eisenhower later said of the men who took the bridge, "That was not the biggest battle that ever was. But for me it always typified one thing, the dash, the ingenuity, the readiness at the first opportunity that characterizes the American soldier." The Ludendorff Bridge was never rebuilt. The twin stone towers that had guarded both ends of the crossing still stand on their respective banks, silent sentinels overlooking the Rhine. In 1980, the surviving western towers were transformed into the Peace Museum Bridge of Remagen. A plaque on the tower walls carries words that speak for both sides. "Constructed for war, destroyed in war, the towers shall always remind. Here fought the soldiers of two great nations. Here died the heroes from near and far." The men who crossed that bridge came from towns across America, a butcher from Ohio, a young officer from Nebraska, engineers and infantry from every corner of the country. They faced an extraordinary moment and rose to meet it. Their courage shortened the bloodiest war in history and brought home soldiers who might otherwise have died in the Rhine's cold waters. If this story gave you something to think about, hit the like button. Subscribe to World War Declassified for new videos every week. the stories they never put in the textbooks. Thank you for watching.